The Kipchaks, the real story of Dracula. Shrouded in a curtain of wild vines and mystical stories, the architectural complex of the Városliget, the city park, in Budapest. Vajdahunyad Castle is so beautiful and it seems very ancient, but in fact, this castle has nothing to do with the Middle Ages. It was built in the 19th century. This castle, which is not ancient at all, has nevertheless already acquired its ghosts, and very tangible they are. Once, in the dark of night, or at the twilight of the day, it's not known for certain, the most famous otherworldly character of this or any other century became manifest in an inconspicuous corner of the palace. This was Count Dracula, as if brought to life from the film. A famous Hungarian actor in a famous Hungarian palace, albeit a decorative one, but the building was copied from the original, the real ancestral Corvin Castle in the south of Transylvania. Vajdahunyad Castle is a copy of the Hungarian Hunedoara Castle. This castle belonged to a famous Hungarian family of aristocrats called the Hunyadi. How is this castle related to the legendary vampire, and why was it called Dracula? Who was the prototype for the bloodthirsty count, and how similar was he to the story? And how does this relate to the history of Kazakhstan? What was the bloodline of the legendary Dracula? His ancestors were genuinely from the steppe. Why was he called a dragon? He was a much respected ruler of his time. How did the famous horror story come about? He was not actually a vampire. He was a man of noble birth. A smear campaign in the Middle Ages, the ancestors of the Wallachian prince, how the story was concocted and why they called him the devil, the Kipchaks, the real story of Dracula, reflections on history, our version. Chapter 1, Real Blood. He never visited the Republic of San Marino, but he is as well known here as he is throughout the world. A children's museum full of exhibits unsuitable for children. The Lord of the Vampires, Count Dracula, is terrible and mighty, the hero of an incredibly successful novel. His face was a strong aquiline, with a high bridge of the thin nose and peculiarly arched nostrils, with a lofty domed forehead and bushy eyebrows. The mouth was fixed and rather cruel-looking, with peculiarly sharp white teeth. These protruded over the lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed an astonishing vitality. Bram Stoker, Dracula. Bram Stoker most likely based this image on the surviving portrait. But what, apart from appearance, has a literary character in common with a real person? He was not actually a vampire. He was a man of noble origins. A nobleman in the 15th century, or, as they called him, the sovereign of Wallachia, a small principality in the territory of medieval Cumania. His name was Vlad III Basarab, a representative of the famous Romanian dynasty. The father of this Basarab, who was a man of the steppe by his ancestry, was the founder of that dynasty. His name was either Tikhomir or Toktomer. After Tikhomir there was Basarab, who gave the name to the Basarab dynasty, and Vlad Tepes belonged to the Basarab dynasty. According to British historiographers, that same Tikhomir or Toktomir was a descendant of Chinggis Khan. One of the theories relates to the son of Jochi, Allegedly, Vlad Dracula is a descendant of Tuk Timur. In principle, this hypothesis matches in terms of the chronology, but there is less of a match in terms of the territory. Tuk Timur's territory included Mangyshlak, Astrakhan, and the North Caucasus, which is far removed from what would become Wallachia. However, at that time, the Wallachian lands were part of the Golden Horde. Jochi's empire arose in the Kazakh steppe, from Irtish to the Danube. He reached the Danube. According to research, there were overall 3 more descendants of Jochi that had the name Tuk Timur, and they were active during the same period of history. Perhaps one of them is the very Toktomer, the legendary father of Basarab. Some researchers argue that the search for the ancestors of the famous vampire should begin with those with the blood of the Khan. The descendants of Chinggis Khan were highly valued. Their position was always respected, and the princes from this dynasty always had a high social position. Those supporting another theory say that this is exactly why the great-grandfathers of Vlad Dracula would hardly conceal this fact from the general public. The version regarding the Kipchak origins of the Basarabs is mainly found amongst researchers from Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Ukraine. I think that he is, in any case, of Kipchak origin, of nomadic origin. The ruling dynasty of Wallachia, the Romanian principality, originated from the Kipchaks. Basarab was a descendant of the Kipchaks. They say that the name makes it clear. The first part, bas, comes from the verb to rule. The second, abba, is a respectful term for father or the head. Names with such an ending belonged only to the ruling branches of the Kipchak or Kuman families. Accordingly, his name has an obvious Turkic etymology, Basar Abba.
Kipchaks founded several dynasties in Bulgaria and also in Romania, and one smaller group came to Hungary.
Today, only geneticists can reliably determine what line the bloodthirsty Dracula was part of. For now, the next step is to test the hypothesis against the clan of Chinggis Khan. If it is confirmed, the number of potential relatives of the vampire in Kazakhstan alone would number in the tens of thousands. If we talk about those very blood groups belonging to the descendants of Chinggis Khan, which is C3, but now known as C2, then indeed over 40% of the population, most of them in fact, belong to this group. Of course, no one examined the genetic code of Dracula himself, as there were no DNA tests at that time. A direct descendant of this medieval ruler has not been found either. Unfortunately, the Basarab house was more successful in spreading its name than in passing on its genes. Perhaps even Dracula himself was unaware of the origin of his ancestors. By that time, he already spoke Latin, he was a Christian, and he did not mention his origin. But his ancestors were genuinely from the steppe. So why was he called Dracula? How did the symbol of the nomads become chivalrous? And who did the dragons defeat? Chapter 2: Father of Dragons. Better known is the story of how the Kipchak, or a descendant of Chinggis Khan, or put more simply a person of steppe origin, Vlad III Basarab, became Dracula. Yet this also happened before his birth. His nickname, Dracula, may have originated from Duk or Drak, which means dragon. The story takes us back to Hungary and Budapest once more. During the reign of Sigismund I, this castle was already considered the largest in Europe. The building of this castle began in the 12th century, that is, in the age of siege warfare. Some walls were destroyed and others were built right on top of them. The king of Hungary and later of Croatia, Germany, Bohemia and Poland not only improved the Buda castle. In 1408, Sigismund I founded an elite knightly order. Somewhere in these courtyards, magnificent initiation ceremonies for new crusaders were performed. Vlad Tepes was called Dracula or Dragon because he and his father were members of the Knightly Royal Society of Dragons, which was founded by the Hungarian monarch. The emblem of the order was the golden dragon, a symbol of victory over sin. Why this mythical beast was chosen by the Society of Knights is an incredible story. For Christians, this fantastic animal was the vivid embodiment of the forces of darkness. The nomads, on the other hand, saw it as a sacred patron. The Kipchaks revered the dragon as a totem animal alongside the wolf and the hound. Here is an interesting fact. On the territory of, let's say, Ukraine, the Northern Caucasus and Bulgaria, archaeologists tend to find the same artifacts and the same symbols. For example, during the excavation of the Shilovka mound, bone and belt buckles with images of wolf dragons, the head of a wolf on the body of a dragon, were found. The same artifacts were found in Bulgaria, Turkey, and in our country it is used in decorative arts. There are lots of iconographic images of dragons and snakes. These are even depicted on ceramic vessels. For Christians, the dragon is generally a synonym for the devil, and suddenly this symbol, very popular among the steppe and Asian peoples, became central in the order of the Crusaders, the defenders of the faith. The Dragonists were an influential organization. Dracula's father made the title his last name, and he minted coins with the image of the mythical beast. The one and only task of the Dragon Knights was to fight against the Turkish or Ottoman Empire. Dracula was an excellent warrior. He defended his homeland from the Turks and became famous for this. He was a much respected ruler at that time. So what are we left with? A European and a steppe aristocrat of either Genghis Khan's or Kipchak bloodline? A dragon knight and also a defender of his homeland. However, in the literary and cinematic records, he is the greatest vampire of all time. Why did the historical chronicle become a tale of horror? What did his contemporaries write about Vlad Dracula? And how did medieval propaganda work? Chapter 3. A Prisoner of the Turks. The heart of ancient Constantinople and of the entire Byzantine Empire stopped beating in May 1453. It was then that the most powerful enemy of Dracula, Mehmet II the Conqueror, rode on a white horse into the cathedral of Hagia Sophia and ordered that it be turned into a mosque. Sultan Mehmet played a huge role in the life of Vlad III. Researchers believe that it was his influence that caused the Wallachian ruler to become who he was. Vlad Tepes, Count Dracula, was indeed very cruel. In general, in terms of cruelty in those ancient times, almost all those who ruled were as brutal as each other. It is a fact that they were brutalized, hung up, or rather impaled. Pregnant women's bellies were cut open. All of this went on. Another nickname for Dracula is Tepes, the Impaler. This type of punishment was first witnessed by the Wallachian prince in Turkey. As a teenager, Vlad, along with his brother Radu, was a hostage of Sultan Mehmet. as guarantor of the Wallachian Principality's loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. According to one version of events, he was humiliated in every possible way and even tortured. According to another, Dracula lived like a prince and received a good education. The 15th century was the time when the Ottoman Empire flourished. It was a time when many historic events occurred and were recorded in the annals of Ottoman history. Thanks to the Turkish Sultan, Vlad took the princely role following the death of his father. The Sultan gifted Dracula with money, horses, clothes, magnificent tents, which a master should have, and sent him to the Wallachian land as soon as was possible so that he could rule in place of his father. He left his younger brother at the court. Konstantin Mikhailovich, Memories of a Janissary. There is very little data about the first reign of Vlad Dracula. His second term lasted 6 years, and he became known far beyond the borders of the small principality off the banks of the Danube. First of all, Tepesh brutally avenged the death of his parent and older brother. He executed 10 boyars. However, some claim that 20,000 were condemned to death. In fact, numerous sources indicate that he either punished justly for any violation or impaled hundreds of thousands of those found guilty. At the same time, the prince communicated quite normally with neighboring sovereigns. I must also say that he was on very good terms with King Matthias. But the Turkish Sultan, in spite of everything, remained his main enemy. Dracula participated in several military campaigns against the Turks. On one occasion, he somehow even stopped a 100,000 strong army with his army of 10,000. He slashed and burned the ground behind him, poisoned wells, and made surprise attacks. The Great Turk announced a punitive campaign against Dracula. He built fortifications in the middle of the country of the Wallachians and set up camp. Dracula boldly came to his enemies through the mountains every night, causing damage, and the army stayed in the country for about 2 months, starving in the camp and suffering from diseases. The Great Turk, in despair, decided to leave. From the Chronicle, Descendants of the Ottoman House. In the end, Vlad was betrayed by his own brother, the one that was held in captivity. Radu, according to some sources the favorite of the Sultan, persuaded the Wallachians to surrender to the Turks. When Dracula did not receive the promised help from King Matthias, he fled to Hungary. Subsequently, King Matthias imprisoned him. It is called the King of Castles. The Romanian Hunyadwar Palace was once part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As some researchers say, Vlad Dracula spent many years within its walls. To celebrate the millennium of its new homeland, this palace was chosen as the finest example of Hungarian Gothic. That's how a replica of it appeared in Budapest. So why did Matthias put Dracula in prison? I don't know for certain if there were any letters testifying to the fact that Dracula was accused of conspiracy with the Turks. Around the same time, malicious pamphlets about the sadistic deeds of Vlad III flooded Europe. According to this version of events, this smear campaign was initiated by King Matthias. Allegedly, the Hungarian monarch was responsible for the funds issued by the Pope for the crusade against the Turks. But the King of Hungary, having spent all the money, did not take part, and he had to explain why he did not assist the troops of Dracula. The best explanation seemed to be the unseen atrocities of the Monster King. What actually happened is unknown, but after a few years, Matthias freed Dracula and even married his sister to. After 12 years of captivity, Vlad Dracula became one of the generals of the Hungarian king Matthias Corvin, and then he was killed during the war with the Turks. His death itself is also very mysterious in terms of where he died and where he was buried. Either he was betrayed by one of his own, or that, in the heat of the battle, he was simply mistaken for a Turk. At this time, Dracula's head seems to have been sent to Sultan Mehmed. In general, all of this is a grim tale, and Dracula's terror-inspiring image remains in medieval literature. However, there is only one mention of him as a vampire in the chronicles. Dracula once had dinner among the impaled corpses. There were many of them around his table. He took pleasure in this, but his servant, who served him food, could not endure the stench of the bodies. So he pinched his nose and turned away. Dracula immediately ordered that the servant be impaled, saying, "There you may sit on high, and the stench will be far from you." From the legend of Dracula the Warlord. Surprisingly, there is respect felt towards Dracula, even amongst the countless horrors. Here is a quote: "He was wise and just, and no one dared to steal during his reign. They were afraid. At public fountains, gold cups were even used for water, and no one took them." What does the real prince have in common with the Count from the book? How did Bram Stoker discover this story? And how can one gain immortal glory? Epilogue: Lord of the Vampires. He never suffered from the so-called disease of vampires, porphyria, which is a genetic disorder manifesting itself in allergies to sunlight and garlic. It is mentioned only once that he liked to dip bread into the blood of his enemies. But according to the written sources, Prince Dracula can hardly be accused of anything supernatural. This is permissible in the genre of fiction. However, there are no sources pointing to its veracity. But cruelty and despotism are real phenomena of that time. So why exactly did he become the bloody Count? Prince Dracula gained his posthumous fame several centuries later. It was in London in 1890. It is not known whether the meeting happened by chance. According to one version of events, they met at a dinner after a performance. According to another, Bram Stoker turned to an Orientalist for advice. The Hungarian Orientalist and traveller Armin Vambary once told the English writer Bram Stoker the story of Vlad Tepes. This is how the well-known book about Count Dracula was born. Vambary, of course, knew the history of both his native Austro-Hungary and Turkey perfectly. He went to Istanbul and learned Turkish, and then he converted to Islam, and as a dervish dressed in rags, he went throughout the whole of Central Asia. The English novelist was delighted with the stories of the Anglo-Hungarian Orientalist. He even based the hero of his novel, Professor Van Helsing, on him. He is a philosopher and a metaphysician, and one of the most advanced scientists of his day, and he has, I believe, an absolutely open mind. This with an iron nerve, a temper of the ice brook, and an indomitable resolution. Bram Stoker, Dracula. Surely Stoker also learned from Vambary about the she-wolf, the progenitor of the Turks, and about a sacred custom when two people, sealed with an oath, cut their hands with a dagger as a sign of loyalty and drank each other's blood. The main goal of Hungarian Oriental studies is to prove their origin from the Turkic peoples. Vambary also undertook such a task. One way or another, ancient legends are woven throughout the written history of Dracula, and before long the Count was said to come from the land of wolves, and also command these animals. The novel became a bestseller within days of publication, and from Dracula, Hollywood fashioned a creature of monstrous charm. How unpredictable history can be.